Hello, my name is Brian O'Shea. I'll be looking at the four films produced after the Civil Rights Movement. I think this is important because you can see the development of the themes that I discussed previously that were evident in the four previous films and see how the themes of rebellion, revolt, and also the systematic oppression that slaves were under, how those themes progress and evolved into these four movies. So I'll be breaking down the four movies that um, occurred after the Civil Rights Movement. So let's get started. The first film in these four series is Amistad. I think this film flipped the script because it portrayed slaves as sympathetic figures who were horribly mistreated by their white suppressors. You felt sorrow for the slaves when they were forced onto the boat and barely fed by the white men on the boat, and the white men were depicted as despicable people who tossed slaves over the side of the boat as if they were animals, if they didn't have enough food for them. Past films didn't portray slaves as these sympathetic figures and characters, but instead as animals who needed to be controlled and maintained by their white owners, because if they weren't, they would kill and commit crimes and do horrible things because it was just in their nature to do so. This film showed them as innocent people stolen from their country and treated as property. And I think, similarly to Beloved, which I'll talk about, the way the film was produced showed that society was changing and becoming more accepting of its dark past and was more willing to tell that dark side of its story, whereas in previous films, it was told in somewhat of a positive light and told as something that needed to be done. Society had come to realize its past mistakes and weren't shying away from just how horribly African Americans were being treated during this time. This film's acceptance of giving slaves their freedom differs greatly from the themes of past films. Past films showed slaves as happy people and as people who were eager to be servants for white people and as people who didn't seek freedom from the oppressive system that they were under. And when they were given their freedom in Birth of a Nation, one of the previous films we watched, they were shown as people who couldn't handle the freedom and weren't able to function as a part of society, and they would, abuse white people, push white people across the street, and they were just seen as like very abusive when they were given this freedom. Through the court proceedings of this film, though, you see that the slaves just want their freedom so they can return to their native homes that they grew up in and that they just want to be treated equally. We see the evolution of a society more accepting of revolt from oppressed people because society had lived through the civil rights movement and had seen how rebellion changed the oppressive system. John Quincy Adams' speech at the end of this movie was very moving for me because it showed that society had become much more sympathetic to the struggles of African Americans. And in his speech, he even said that it's very understanding to see that African Americans were willing to do anything that they could, and that included killing people in order to gain their freedom because at that point, they were just so desperate and were willing to do anything to achieve that freedom. So I thought it was very telling that society had become that understanding of rebellion and revolt. The next movie is Beloved. I believe this film depicted slavery in a much more realistic way as well. Seth's flashbacks to her past as a slave show it as a traumatizing experience that left a permanent scar on her life. In past films, slavery was depicted as an accepted way of life that was necessary for the functioning of society. And as I said previously, slaves were represented as people who didn't mind being servants for white people. And it was told in a very more positive light than these films. Slaves in past films even served as comic relief characters. In this film, however, slavery is portrayed as a horrifying experience that the main character is so desperately trying to avoid because psychologically she's so damaged from it, she knows what would occur if she were to go back to that life. She's even willing to kill herself and her children to avoid going back to that life. So you see how desperate she is to avoid going back to her previous life. And I think it shows that society had become much more understanding of how horrible their past was and was more accepting of showing slavery in that dark light, which it was. The film doesn't show the systematic oppression of African Americans as much as other films. I saw it as a former slave who had gone through that horrible experience and was still dealing with the psychological consequences from her experience. I believe this theme is representative of the struggles African Americans were going through at the time that this film was produced. The civil rights movement had helped African Americans overcome many systematic struggles and problems that kept them oppressed in the country, but they were still dealing with a lot of discrimination when it came to housing discrimination and workplace discrimination. And the civil rights movement had hit a bit of a bump in the road because the community had already overcame so many struggles and didn't really know where to turn next. And Seth was sort of in that same situation. She had overcome her past struggles with slavery. However, her dark past kept her from leading a normal life because it was so traumatic, and there were obviously still a lot more to be done in order for African Americans to be treated equally in the society at the time that the film was portrayed. So, the next film is 12 Years a Slave, a much more recent film, and I think this film is the most humanizing portrayal of an African American slave in all the films that we had viewed so far. And I say that because Solomon had a wonderful life with a wife and children from the first scene that I viewed, and seemed to be very well respected and liked by his peers in the community that he was living in. That is before he was tricked by the two white men at the beginning of the film to accompany him to Washington as entertainers, and he was tricked and sold into a slave trade in New Orleans. And I think first showing Solomon living a happy, normal life before being tricked and sold off as a slave, I think it makes it all the more sympathetic because when he's kidnapped and brutally beaten him after proclaiming his freedom, you realize that backstory that was told about him was very rare, and it wasn't something that was shown in previous films because in previous films, African Americans didn't really have a backstory or anything that really made you feel any sort of connection with them at all. And other films depict slaves as nameless people who have no distinct personality. Conversation held between Epps and Bass also is profound, in my opinion, in its significance to how far African Americans have come. Bass is unsettled because he is from Canada. He's a traveler from Canada, and he's unsettled by how horribly mistreated the slaves are in America, and he's not used to this culture because, as I said, he's from Canada. And he says this to Epps, who is one of Solomon's masters. He tells him that although it's the law in the country that he is allowed to have these slaves, that laws can change, and the ultimate truth is that we are all equal and we are all human and we should all be treated as such. And I think this perspective is a very refreshing one, one that hasn't been spoken in any films really up until this point. And I believe this exchange is one between two men who come from different societies. As I said, Epps is a master slave owner in America, and Bass is a Canadian traveler who hadn't really been exposed to this kind of situation in America. And I think this speaks to the evolution of societal beliefs when it comes to equal treatment towards African Americans, because in past films, like I said, it was just their way of life. They didn't have that differing perspective to tell them that obviously these are all human beings, and they never really had their system of beliefs challenged like that before. And you saw Epps was kind of taken aback by Bass's like very different contrasting beliefs, and obviously he was very agitated, but you could see kind of like the ignorance that he had because he just hadn't been exposed to that differing set of beliefs. And when you hear it spoken by Bass like so simply and put in such simple terms like that, then it makes it just that more simple to understand that like how wrong and terrible what was happening to them was. So for me, I think this is one of the most profound, powerful speeches in all the four films I watched, and I've watched it a couple times. It was actually pretty moving, pretty inspirational scene. And then in the last film, Birth of a Nation, which is not the original Birth of a Nation that we had previously discussed, but was kind of a new take on it, and it was produced in 2016. And I felt the overarching theme in this film was empowerment for a human to reach their full potential. And at the beginning of the film, Nat is a slave who is discovered by the slave owner's wife. She discovers that he has the ability to read, and she takes it upon himself to teach Nat how to read and practice the teachings of the Bible. And she told him and his mother that she believes that his knowledge is a gift, and she feels that it's necessary for the boy to reach his full potential with that gift. And although his preachings were used to maintain and control slaves, and he eventually had to become a slave himself, picking cotton in the fields, I think it was still originally done out of compassion from the slave owner's wife, and I saw it as a gesture that was rarely given on behalf of white slave owners. Nat helps slaves in the community in a revolt to gain their freedom. So we see another theme of rebellion and revolt in the more recent films. And although they fought valiantly and almost succeeded, ultimately they failed, and Nat is captured and hung. And we then see a young boy watching Nat be hung, and we fast forward to later on in his life when he himself is fighting in the Civil War alongside African Americans fighting for their freedom again. And I think the theme of rebellion and how it's portrayed is a stark contrast to the original Birth of a Nation, as I said previously, because rebellion in the original film was depicted as slaves being violent animals, killing, innocent people in a very negative portrayal, and kind of exploited all the regular stereotypes at that time of African Americans. And although the rebellion in this film is very violent and there is a lot of killing, it is done in search of a better life for the slaves who had been oppressed, and that story was told that they were doing it to claim their freedom and be treated equally. And I think you could reflect that to some similar themes to Adam's speech at the end of Amistad, like I said, that for people who are so horribly abused and oppressed, it's understandable that they will fight for their freedom by any means necessary, which including being violent and killing people. I think the progression of this theme shows what impact the civil rights movement had and its successful conclusion had on our society, because although it was hard fought and it wasn't always peaceful, we as a society had seen how successful it was and become more understanding of what African Americans were willing to do to attain their freedom. And as I said, it wasn't always peaceful, but us as a society, we watched like the progression and steps that was taken by the civil rights movement to gain their freedom. And by the end, we saw how successful it was. So of course, today, we're much more understanding looking back on our history of what African Americans were willing to do to get that freedom. So in conclusion, I think, as I said, the themes of rebellion and revolt progressed dramatically from the films before the Civil Rights Movement and the films after the Civil Rights Movement, and also how the systematic oppression of slaves was depicted between the two sets of movies, I think, is a very stark contrast, and I think is very telling to how successful the civil rights movement was, and also how much society had evolved and became more understanding of African American struggles. So that's my analysis, and thanks for watching.